There is a pattern buried inside the history of the American ruling class that nobody is supposed to notice, not because it's hidden behind locked vaults or classified government files, but because it's sitting in plain sight on the surface of every history book ever written about this country, and yet no one in those books ever asks the one question that should have been asked 150 years ago. Why did every single one of them build their mansions in the same decade? Not the same century, not the same generation, the same decade. The Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Astors, the Belmonts, the Fricks, the Morgans, the Hearsts, every family whose name is carved into the marble of American wealth and power commissioned their grand palatial estates, their Newport summer cottages the size of European royal palaces, their Fifth Avenue fortresses, and their hilltop manor houses within a compressed window of time so narrow it barely makes sense unless you already know what happened right before it. And right before it, a series of fires tore through the major cities of North America with a ferocity and a spread that even today defies conventional explanation. Chicago, October 1871. Boston, November 1872. And dozens of smaller cities in between and after. Fires that didn't just burn buildings, fires that burned entire city grids. Fires that melted stone and twisted iron and reduced century-old civic architecture to rubble in hours. Fires that, according to the official record, were started by a cow kicking over a lantern, or by a carelessly disposed cigarette, or simply by the dry autumn air and bad luck. But here is what they don't teach you. Here is the part that disappears when you turn the page in the textbook. The buildings that burned in those fires were not the rough wooden shacks of a frontier town. Many of them were massive, ornate, built in styles that historians today struggle to explain, given the supposed technological capacity of the era. And the families who emerged from the smoke and the ash as the new owners of the land were not the families who had lived there before. They were new, and they were suddenly impossibly rich. And within 10 years they had constructed estates so vast and so technically sophisticated that engineers of the time openly admitted they didn't fully understand how they had been built so quickly. If you are the kind of person who has ever looked at the skyline of a 19th century American city and felt something was wrong, something you couldn't name, then this video is for you. Stay with us, because what we are about to walk through is not a conspiracy theory. It is a timeline, and timelines don't lie. If this is the kind of history they decided not to teach you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week we go deeper into the layers they painted over. The year 1871 is one of the most important years in the modern history of North America, and almost nobody treats it that way. In the standard telling, it is remembered primarily as the year Chicago burned. But if you pull back the lens and look at the whole continent in the autumn of that year, something far stranger comes into view. On the night of the 8th of October, 1871, the city of Chicago erupted in a fire that would burn for 2 full days. By the time it was over, an estimated 17,000 structures had been destroyed. Approximately 300 people were confirmed dead, though historians believe the real number was significantly higher because of how many records were consumed by the flames themselves. Roughly 100,000 residents, nearly a third of the city's entire population, were left homeless overnight. The official story, the one that became a cultural legend almost immediately, was that a cow belonging to a woman named Catherine O'Leary kicked over a kerosene lantern in a barn on the city's southwest side. The fire spread from there, driven by high winds, and grew into a citywide catastrophe. This story was eventually acknowledged, even by contemporary journalists, as almost certainly fabricated the reporter who first published it. Admitted years later that he had invented the O'Leary detail because it made a better story. But by then, the origin myth had been cemented into the public consciousness, and no one in an official capacity seemed eager to dislodge it. What investigators at the time and independent researchers for more than a century since have struggled with is the simple fact that wood does not burn the way Chicago burned that night. Iron railroad tracks melted. Stone facades cracked and collapsed inward from extreme internal heat. Sand on the shores of Lake Michigan fused into glass. Sand fusing into glass requires temperatures of approximately 1600 degrees Celsius. A wood fire in a barn does not produce 1600 degrees Celsius. At the same time, dozens of other fires broke out across the Midwest on the same night. The town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, burned in a forest fire so vast and so sudden that more than 2,000 people died within hours, a death toll more than 6 times that of Chicago. And yet Peshtigo is barely a footnote because Chicago was the famous city. On the same night, fires swept through parts of Michigan, destroying several towns and killing hundreds more. Multiple massive fires in multiple states on the same calendar night. Meteorologists have proposed comet debris, electrostatic atmospheric conditions, and unusually dry seasonal air as possible causes. None of these explanations are fully satisfying. None have been conclusively proven. What they all share is a refusal to ask the question that sits underneath all of them. What, specifically, was destroyed? Because in the alternative history community, and particularly within the framework of what has come to be called Tartaria research, this is the central question. Not how did the fires start, but what did the fires erase? The theory of Tartaria, for those encountering it for the first time, begins with a simple observation about historical maps. On European maps produced between the 15th and the 19th centuries, there exists a vast territory labelled Tartaria or Tartary, covering much of Central Asia, Siberia, and in some versions extending into what would become the eastern United States. This territory is depicted with the markers of a developed civilization, cities, trade routes, populated centers, and yet, in modern mainstream history, it is either ignored entirely or reduced to a vague reference to the Mongol successor states. Tartaria researchers argue that the historical record has been deliberately edited, and that what these maps were actually depicting was an advanced global civilization that predated the European colonial powers, possessed sophisticated architectural and engineering knowledge, and was systematically dismantled through a series of engineered catastrophes, including, centrally, a series of fires in the 19th century designed to destroy the last remaining physical evidence of this civilization's presence on the North American continent. This is where the Great Fires enter the picture, not as accidents of history, but as demolition events. The argument proceeds like this. The buildings that stood in Chicago, in Boston, in San Francisco, and in dozens of other North American cities, before the Great Fires of the 1870s and 1880s, were not the buildings constructed by the American settlers who claimed to have built them. They were the remnants of a prior civilization, a civilization with architectural capabilities that far exceeded what the colonial settlers possessed, and they had been incorporated into the growing American urban fabric as civic buildings, as train stations, as courthouses, as public markets, and as private estates. The fires removed them, and what replaced them was constructed in deliberate imitation of what had been destroyed, but cruder, faster, and controlled by a new class of owners. The Gilded Age was not the story of industrial titans building a new civilization from scratch. It was the story of industrial titans inheriting the ruins of an old one, claiming credit for what had already been built, and using the chaos of the fires as a cover to consolidate ownership of the land underneath. Now, whether you accept that interpretation or prefer to engage with the documented historical record on its own terms, there is a set of facts that sit at the center of this story that cannot be dismissed, because they are simply true. And the most important of those facts is the timeline. Andrew Carnegie did not become the richest man in America because he invented steel. He became the richest man in America because he controlled the production of steel at precisely the moment when every burned American city needed to rebuild. The timing of the fires and the timing of his ascent are not coincidental. They are sequential, and the sequence runs in one direction. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust was formalized in 1871, year before the Chicago fire. By 1872, in the chaos of post-fire reconstruction, Standard Oil had consolidated control of oil refining in Cleveland through a process Rockefeller called the Great Anaconda, a systematic elimination of competitors through pricing pressure, railway discrimination agreements, and documented coercion. The cities needed oil for light and heat while they rebuilt. Rockefeller owned the oil. The fires had created the demand. He was positioned to meet it. The Vanderbilt family's wealth, built on railroads, expanded dramatically in the decade following the fires. The reconstruction of Chicago required mass transport of lumber, stone, iron, and steel. The railroads the Vanderbilts controlled became the arteries of reconstruction. The burned city was a customer of enormous and immediate need. The railroad barons were the only suppliers capable of meeting it. J. P. Morgan, who by the 1870s was already positioning himself as the central node of American financial power, played a specific and well-documented role in the financing of post-fire reconstruction. The rebuilding of Chicago alone required capital on a scale that no single investor or local bank could provide. It required the kind of coordinated financial architecture that only a figure like Morgan, with his connections to European banking houses, including the Rothschild network, could organize. Reconstruction bonds were issued, reconstruction financing was structured, and the terms of that financing gave the financiers claims on the land, the infrastructure, and the future revenues of the rebuilt cities. The Astor family had been in New York City real estate for decades before the fires. After the Chicago fire, land values in the burned zones collapsed as owners sold at panic prices. The Astors and families like them, families with liquid capital at the ready, bought. Within 5 years, they owned swaths of a rebuilt city at a fraction of pre-fire cost. The fire had transferred wealth from the people who had built the city to the people who had cash to wait out the panic. This is documented history. It is in the ledgers. And it raises a question the documented record cannot answer by itself. Did anyone know the fires were coming? Because if someone knew, the financial positioning of these families, the consolidations, the capitalizations, the trust formations, all in the year or two immediately preceding the fires, looks less like coincidence and more like preparation. Now, let us talk about the buildings themselves, because this is where the Tartaria framework makes its most interesting argument, and where even the mainstream historical record begins to develop its own strange textures. The architecture of the Gilded Age is one of the most technically anomalous episodes in the history of construction. In the span of roughly 20 years, between 1880 and 1900, the American wealthy class commissioned and completed a collection of structures so vast, so detailed, and so technically demanding that modern construction historians openly acknowledge difficulty in explaining how they were built with the technology and labor force that supposedly existed at the time. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, completed in 1895 for George Washington Vanderbilt II, remains the largest privately owned home in the United States. It contains 250 rooms. Its facade required limestone carved into elaborate French Renaissance detailing. Its basement contains a swimming pool, a bowling alley, and mechanical systems of extraordinary complexity for the period. Construction took 6 years and employed up to 1,000 men at peak activity. Where did those men come from? How was the material transported to a mountain location in the American South? These questions are answered with reference to the Vanderbilt-owned railway line built specifically to access the site, and with reference to imported French craftsmen. But the sheer volume and precision, the hundreds of carved limestone faces, the hundreds of thousands of handmade bricks, the acres of ornamental ironwork implies a workforce and supply chain that the documented labor records of the period do not fully account for. The Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, completed in 1895, is 70 rooms and roughly 40,000 square feet. It was built in 11 months. The exterior is Italian Renaissance in style, executed in limestone imported from Caen, France. The interior features ceilings painted by Italian artists, fireplaces of African marble, columns of alabaster, and a great hall with a 45-foot coffered ceiling. 11 months for 70 rooms of imported stone. Compare this to any modern construction timeline and the math becomes difficult. A 60-unit luxury apartment building with current machinery takes 2 to 3 years. The Breakers took 11 months. Marble House, also in Newport, also Vanderbilt, completed in 1892. Cost at time of construction: $11 million, representing roughly $350 million in today's purchasing power. The interior gold room is sheathed floor to ceiling in gilded bronze and sienna marble. The carving on the exterior facade is essentially indistinguishable in quality from the finest examples of European royal architecture of the 17th century. The Tartaria researchers ask a question the mainstream historians don't. Who trained the people who did this work? Where is the documented lineage of the craftsmen who carved these stones and cast these bronzes? In Europe, craftsmen who produced work of this quality belonged to centuries-old guild traditions. In America, in the 1890s, there is no such lineage. The official explanation is that the work was done by European immigrant craftsmen, but the volume of the work, across dozens of simultaneous Gilded Age estates, implies a supply of such craftsmen that does not show up in the immigration records of the period. The alternative explanation is that some portion of this construction was not new at all, that some of what passed as freshly built Gilded Age architecture was existing Tartarian structure, absorbed, renovated, and claimed as new by the families who had purchased the underlying land. This explanation predicts something specific, that Gilded Age buildings should show evidence of prior structural work inconsistent with their claimed construction date. And in fact, photographs of Gilded Age estate construction in progress frequently show existing foundation work of a quality inconsistent with the construction timeline for the project above. Interior photographs of completed Gilded Age estates frequently show room dimensions and proportional systems that follow precise classical geometric ratios associated with a design tradition far older than the American. Architects who supposedly designed them. Richard Morris Hunt, who designed many of the major Gilded Age commissions, was trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and his architecture is conventionally explained as a sophisticated application of European academic classical tradition to American wealth. But Tartaria researchers point out that the proportional systems used in Hunt's buildings appear in architecture from multiple continents and multiple periods that predate the European classical tradition, sharing mathematical constants and spatial relationships that imply a common origin, rather than parallel development. That common origin, in the Tartaria framework, is the global civilization that mainstream history has fragmented into separate narratives about separate ancient cultures. Now let us turn to an event that stands as perhaps the single most discussed piece of evidence in the Tartaria research community, and that represents one of the genuinely strangest episodes in the documented history of American architecture: the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. The exposition, commonly called the White City, was built in Chicago on the shore of Lake Michigan, on a site that had been, 22 years earlier, part of the area affected by the Chicago fire. It was organized to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. It was designed by a committee of architects that included Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the landscape, and Daniel Burnham, who served as director of works. It opened in May 1893 and closed in October 1893. During that 6-month period, it received 27 million visitors, a number representing roughly 40% of the entire population of the United States at the time. What was actually built at the White City has been a source of genuine historical puzzlement ever since. In approximately 2 years of construction, a site of roughly 600 acres on the Chicago lakefront was transformed into a complete city of monumental neoclassical architecture. The Central Court of Honor contained 14 major buildings, each of them enormous, each of them finished in a white stucco facade with ornamental detail, so finely executed that contemporary visitors compared it favorably to the finest civic architecture in Europe. The domes, the colonnades, the grand staircases, the elaborate sculptural programs, all of it built in less than 2 years for an event lasting 6 months, and almost all of it demolished within a year of the exposition's close. The official explanation for the construction speed is that the buildings were not built to last. They were temporary structures of wood and plaster, finished in a white cement-based stucco that created the illusion of stone. The demolition, after the close of the exposition, was planned from the beginning, because the buildings were never intended to be permanent. But photographs of the White City, examined carefully, tell a complicated story. The buildings do not photograph like temporary wooden structures. The scale and the proportional relationships between elements, the column spacing, the dome heights, the relationship of each building to the others across the court are exactly what you would expect from permanent stone construction, designed to be experienced at human scale over years of use. Temporary exhibition architecture, by contrast, tends to be oversized and theatrical, designed for visual impact at a distance rather than spatial experience up close. The White City buildings do not look theatrical, they look inhabited. Several of the buildings contained mechanical systems, heating, drainage, electrical installations of a sophistication inconsistent with a structure intended for a 6-month lifespan. The machinery hall contained a working central power plant that supplied electricity to the entire grounds. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts building, which at the time was the largest building in the world by floor area, covered 40 acres under a single roof, spanning more than 800 feet without internal columns. A single-span roof of more than 800 feet in 1893, with no columns. This is an extraordinary engineering achievement accomplished by a structural steel truss system designed by engineer Edward Shankland. But the timeline from commission to completion for a structural project of this complexity, with custom steel fabrication and delivery in the 1890s, has never been satisfactorily explained by the documented construction schedule. The Tartaria community's interpretation is direct. The White City was not primarily a construction project, it was a revelation project. It was an organized display of the architectural vocabulary and the spatial language of the prior civilization, a civilization whose remnants were being actively erased from the American urban fabric in the same decade, staged as a temporary spectacle so that it could then be permanently dismissed. You show the people what the old world looked like. You call it a fair, and then you tear it down and tell them it was never real. This interpretation predicts that people who experience the White City would describe it in terms that exceeded normal fair-going language, and this is precisely what the historical record shows. Visitors consistently describe their experience in terms of revelation, of uncanny recognition, of seeing something that should always have existed but somehow had not. Henry Adams wrote that the White City was the first expression of American thought as a unity, and that it stunned him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the grounds, said the landscape reminded him of something he could not name, a quality of settled completeness that was unlike anything he had produced himself. Settled completeness. Not the freshness of new construction, the settled completeness of something that had been there long enough to belong to the earth it stood on. The White City was destroyed by fire in 1894, a fire that started in the casino building and spread through several of the main exhibition halls in a matter of hours. The fire was never conclusively explained. It destroyed what remained of the exposition's central structures, and with it, the most visible physical argument for an alternative architectural inheritance. Now, let us return to the families, because by the 1890s, the estates are rising everywhere, and the money flowing into them is not fully accounted for by the industries these men nominally controlled. The wealth of the Gilded Age oligarchs was not simply the product of business success, however ruthless and monopolistic that business success was. It was also the product of a financial architecture that concentrated the returns of industrialization in a very small number of hands through mechanisms, trust formation, interlocking directorates, railroad rate discrimination, currency manipulation that were not available to ordinary participants in the economy. And the question that Tartaria-adjacent research consistently raises is, who gave these men the keys to that architecture? Who taught them the mechanisms? Where did the template come from? Because the mechanisms of Gilded Age financial consolidation are not American inventions, they are applications of financial techniques developed over centuries by European banking families, primarily the great Venetian and later Dutch and British banking houses, who had been consolidating the wealth of civilizations across multiple continents long before the American Industrial Revolution gave them a new theater of operation. The Morgan banking house's connections to the Rothschild network are documented. The Vanderbilt family's early fortune was built in direct partnership with British capital that came through identifiable banking channels. The Rockefeller consolidation of Standard Oil was financed in part through mechanisms requiring coordinated cooperation of banking institutions that operated across the Atlantic, whose senior partners were not American in origin. The transfer of wealth that occurred through the Great Fires was not a random windfall that happened to benefit locally positioned American entrepreneurs. It was a structured transfer, organized through financial mechanisms that already existed, directed toward families who were already positioned as the American representatives of a much older and much larger financial network. This network is the same one that, in the Tartaria interpretation, organized the erasure of the prior civilization's physical presence from the historical record. Not because that civilization was a military threat, but because its continued physical existence was an argument against the ownership claims of the new order. If the buildings of the old world were still standing, people would ask who built them, and the answer would not be the families whose names were being carved into the foundations of the new order. Tear down the old buildings. Stage some fires to cover the demolition. Position your representatives to buy the land in the chaos. Build new buildings in the style of the old ones, but smaller, cruder, and bearing your family's name instead of theirs. Finance the reconstruction through debt mechanisms that leave the rebuilt cities permanently obligated to the banking network, and tell the historians to call the whole process the birth of modern America. The great estates of the Gilded Age were not the monuments of American self-made success. They were the monuments of a transfer of ownership. And the fires were not disasters. They were the instruments of that transfer. Now this framework requires scrutiny. The strongest evidence in favor of the Tartaria interpretation is also the simplest, the timeline. The concentration of fire events in a narrow window and the concentration of estate construction in the immediately following decade is a real pattern. The financial positioning of the major Gilded Age families in the year before the fires is real. The technical anomalies of Gilded Age construction, the speed, the scale, the craftsmanship without documented precedent are real. The strangeness of the White City's construction and destruction is real. The weakest element is the direct evidentiary link between the fires and an intentional erasing of prior architecture. The alternative interpretation that the fires were extraordinary natural disasters and the Gilded Age families simply positioned themselves to profit from catastrophe is not impossible. Opportunistic exploitation of disaster does not require prior knowledge of the disaster. What the Tartaria framework adds is a vertical dimension. Not just who profited, but from what stock of wealth. Not just who owned the land, but what had stood on it. Not just how fast were the estates built, but who actually knew how to build them. Consider what it would mean if the prior civilization thesis were even partially correct. If even a fraction of what stood in pre-fire Chicago and Boston was not colonial-era American construction, but the inheritance of a more ancient and more technically sophisticated civilization, then the entire narrative of American architectural and civic history would require revision. The mythology of the self-made American city, built from nothing, from raw frontier land, by the energy of settlers and entrepreneurs, would be revealed as exactly that, a mythology constructed over the ruins of something older and deliberately forgotten. The families who commissioned the great Gilded Age estates understood that their wealth was not self-made in any meaningful sense. They had inherited it, or captured it, or been positioned to receive it by forces older than themselves. What they built with it was a statement of ownership, a physical claim on the landscape and the skyline that said, in the only language wealth has ever known, this belongs to us now. The limestone facades of the Vanderbilt estates, the gilded ballrooms of the Astor mansions, the vaulted halls of the Carnegie libraries, and Carnegie built more than 2,000 libraries, whose architecture follows classical proportional systems that no architectural historian has ever satisfactorily traced to a single origin tradition. The stone towers of the Rockefeller family compound at Kikuit, overlooking the Hudson River from a bluff that commanded the view of a valley the Rockefellers did not discover, only purchased. What are these buildings? They are, in the most conventional sense, the products of concentrated wealth and the labor that wealth could command. But they are also physical arguments. Arguments about legitimacy. Arguments about belonging. Arguments that say, we were here when the old world burned, and we own what came after. There is one more thread that needs to be followed before we close, and it concerns the period immediately after the great estates were built. Because the construction of the Gilded Age mansions was not the final act in this story, the final act was the creation of the institutions that would preserve the family's ownership across generations and shape the public's understanding of the history that had placed them there. Between 1890 and 1920, the major Gilded Age families created a network of foundations, universities, museums, and archives that became the dominant custodians of American historical knowledge. The Rockefeller family funded the University of Chicago. The Carnegie family funded the Carnegie Institution for Science. The Morgan family's collection became the core of the Morgan Library. The Vanderbilt family's gifts established Vanderbilt University. These institutions were not simply acts of philanthropy. They were acts of historiography. They funded the writing of history. They set the terms of what counted as evidence. They determined which archives were preserved. They hired the historians who wrote the textbooks and built the museums that displayed the artifacts. And in every case, the history they funded validated the legitimacy of their own position. History that treated the great fires as natural disasters rather than engineered events. History that explained the Gilded Age estates as products of American ingenuity rather than as beneficiaries of a prior civilization's destruction. History that never asked where the craftsmanship came from, or why the foundations didn't match the superstructure, or how 11 months was enough to build 70 rooms of imported stone. The Tartaria community is frequently dismissed as the province of the credulous and the conspiratorial. There is enough nonsense in the periphery of Tartaria research to make that dismissal feel reasonable. But the core of what Tartaria research points to, the anomalies in the historical record, the financial coincidences, the architectural impossibilities, the institutional control of the historical narrative, these are not the products of credulous imagination. They are the products of careful observation of things the official history has consistently failed to explain. The great fires happened, the families emerged, the estates rose. The institutions that wrote the history were funded by the same families whose history those institutions were writing. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented sequence of events. What it means is a question the documented record cannot answer by itself. But it is a question worth asking, because the alternative accepting the lantern and the cow and the dry autumn wind as sufficient to explain how the American ruling class came to own everything it owns, requires a degree of incuriosity about the architecture, of power that serves only those who already own it. The mansions are still standing. Go look at them. Look at the foundations. Look at the proportions. Look at the craftsmanship that no one alive today can fully explain. And ask yourself, not who built them, the official record will give you a name for that, but what was there before? What stood on that land before the fires came, and before the men with the capital arrived to claim the ruins, and before the historians were hired to call the whole thing progress? The answer to that question has been waiting in the stone for 150 years, and the stone has not moved. Only the story above it has.